Wherever you are in the world, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Paul Emilianovich. I'm the project manager / managing director of Participedia. And Participedia is the world's largest database and research community documenting democratic innovations. This event is part of our Teaching Cafe series run every semester, which brings together scholars, activists, artists, and practitioners to reflect on experiences of teaching, learning democracy inside and outside of the classroom. Now, before I pass it over to Tina Nabachi to introduce the speakers and the panel topic, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are all grounded somewhere, despite being present in a virtual space. And Participedia specifically is based on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We show continued solidarity for the defenders and stewards over these lands, despite historical and ongoing colonial violence. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. We very much appreciate it. I will now hand it over to you, Tina.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, everyone, for coming out to join us today. It's exciting to see so many people here for the presentation. We are all very excited to have an opportunity to talk with you today about a project we've been working on in Nosara, Costa Rica, which we'll kind of walk through today. I'm joined here by several members, but not all of the members, but several members of our research team, including Gabby Bruna. Gabby, do you want to give a little wave? Christian Freitag, Greg Munno, and I'm Tina Nabachi. We will be talking about a multi-step participatory process we did to help a community in Nosara, Costa Rica, identify some priorities for its future. This project involved a number of partners, kind of primarily spearheaded by the Demo Lab, or the Democracy Laboratory, which is a nonprofit organization based in San Jose, Costa Rica. I'm from the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration, or PARC, at Syracuse University. Christian is here from the Conservation Law Center at Indiana University, and Greg is here from the Syracuse University Newhouse School of Public Communications. And I think we want to dive right in. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Gabby to help us get situated so that you all can understand some of where Nosara is and kind of get grounded in the context. So Gabby.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Good. All right. So I just want to say that I feel really tranquil in my heart that you guys are taking your time to learn about Nosara, because what is happening in Nosara is happening all over Costa Rica and also all over Latin America in a post-pandemic scenario. So it's really important to talk about this topic in a broader sense of gentrification and development and many things that we're going to talk about today in very natural spaces. So right to the topic, right, we have Central America. In that belly button of America, you have Costa Rica, which has always been a place of transit from ancient cultures to now. And Tina, you can keep going. Inside Costa Rica, we have the Guanacaste province, which is up northwest, and specifically we're going to talk today about one of the blue zones, which is called Nicoya Peninsula. So in this very, very, very rich land of Nicoya, where there's populations that live over 100 years due to the wild combination of different factors that you probably know from reading about blue zones, we have a specific place called Nosara. Nosara is a town. The beach where you have that little surfboard is called Playa Guiones, and it's a combination of a couple of beaches. It's a relatively small place, right? So this is one of the 5 blue zones in the world. It was a relatively unknown district until the New York Times published articles about its beauty and its virtue. So you had like a golden rush of tourism that started from the 60s and then kept evolving. And then fast forward to now, you have like a post-pandemic wellness rush, right? Of people looking for seclusion. You end up with a place that is very in fashion in a way, and is known for its pristine beaches, it's amazing surfing, and it's a vibrant yoga culture. So in essence, in terms of demographics, in 2000, we had a permanent population of over 3,000 people. And 2 decades later, it has grown to maybe 7,000 people, 140% growth. Now, the crucial factor in this is that that's not the important number, it's the amount of visitors. You're having this tourism hotspot receiving over 2 million tourists who visit the nation each year. And obviously in this surge of tourism, you have developers and investors who have come into this like gold rush era for this is probably the third gold rush that Nosara has had. So you have building hotels, you have restaurants, you have other service providing facilities, which are staffed mainly by locals, right? And also migrant workers. So you have like an influx of different types of people. This is basically the town, like the first circle that's up at the top. That's where the town is. That's where the locals live. And then you have where you have on the right side where that's the little fish. That's Playa Guiones. This is where like all the tourists come, right? And Playa Ocional, which we will talk about further, is where there's a huge turtle breeding site. That's really important for in ecological terms. So can you pass the slide, Tina? Thanks. Okay, this is life in the blue zone in terms of what people imagine, right? And what they come to consume, right? So you have very young and hot people like gliding over the beach. You have people learning to surf. You have amazing yoga retreats all year round with people paying all sorts of money to come and learn that practice. You have beautiful restaurants, etc. That is part of Nosara, right? Then you have the other side, right? Can you keep going, Tina? Which is development and construction. So you have huge mansions being built in the mountains, while you have huge potholes that literally like your car can like dive into it. Then you have like very old bridges. You have like private schools from expats that live there that can afford $2,000 a month tuition. And then you have abandoned local schools, right? So there's literally like this massive growth coming in with a very deficient infrastructure. And this is creating a time bomb that not only is reflected in infrastructure that applies ecological pressure, right? But also socially. And that's the one thing that this project has, is that it looked upon the social structures and the social composition of a very mixed place, right? To really understand what can be done. Can you pass the slide? Okay, and now we add like the sweet spot and the fragile part. Being a Costa Rican, I just want to say that this is a beautiful, small, inefficient, and extremely fragile country. It's a gem, but it's a very confused gem, right? So it has huge vision of what it wants in terms of green protection, and that's what it's known for around the world. But we have also like really intense contrast in how we execute that. And in this case, you have Nosara and this town and this vibrant tourism hotspot. And right next to it, in the beach that's next to it, you have one of the most important breeding sites for turtles in the world. You almost have 2 million turtles coming in at the same amount of time in the same season to come and breed. They travel all around the world, and then once a year they come in and they hatch there. And this is all scientists have figured out. It's almost like a magnetic pull. Like even turtles are able to leave, travel around the world, and then go back to the same exact 2 meters where they laid their eggs the last time they did it, right? So this is like science and nature at its best. And this is right next to Nosara. So you have sewage problems, you have population control, you have poachers, you have feral dogs, you have over-tourism, you have people taking selfies with the turtles, right? And all of this is creating a conundrum of situations that we will explore in the Q method further on. And the last slide, Tina. So perfect. With that context and knowing that there's a lot more than I can say, we saw that there was a lack of urban planning, right? That I already mentioned, that the economic benefits have increased immensely. Then you have this tourism-related development, which is not being equated in quality to the infrastructure by the locals. And then you have inequities in the service. So what's happening now is that depending on the social power or the economic capacity of the person, they're able to get ahead in terms of development. So, for example, wealthy or educated people from Costa Rica that are from the city are able to get better jobs moving to Nosara than the locals that have lived there all their life, right? So this is creating also a very intense social differences. And in terms of the social progress index, which was that first line of credibility that we had to implement to work with this community, in 2021, the Nicoya Business School and the Latin American Center for Competitiveness and Sustainable Development deployed what is called the Social Progress Index, which a lot of you may know here, right? So it measures numerous social, economic, and environmental indicators into three categories: basic human necessities, foundations for well-being, and opportunity. So in Nosara, there were around 1,000 responses, and from a 0 to 100 scale, Nosara scored a 78% on basic human necessities, a 66 on well-being, being a hotspot for well-being is pretty low, and a 65 on opportunity, right? But at a more nuanced and subtle level, the SPI showed that Nosara, as compared to other places in Costa Rica, had relatively higher scores for nutrition, for personal security, for freedom of choice, for tolerance, for inclusion. And it had average scores for housing, access to information, healthcare, environmental quality, right? Besides all of that information, what we figured out were that the 5 main concerns among the population were poor infrastructure being the highest, drug addiction, alcoholism, poverty, and unemployment. Let's say you put together drug addiction and alcoholism, but that's basically the main problems that the locals and the entire population, also by expats, have identified as problematic, infrastructure being the most important. And that's the basic plethora of chaos and beauty that Nosara is living through right now. And I'll pass it over to my teammates. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. This is Christian talking now, Christian Freitag. I'm a lawyer by trade, but not by disposition. So I bring an interesting and somewhat different perspective to studying conflict than the conflict resolvers. But Gabby gave a great description just now. I've always thought, now that I've gotten to know Nosara over the last 3 years, been there several times, made some very close friends there, and studied it, of course. It's become clear to me, or it's evident to me, that Nosara is kind of like an old Western movie where think about, I'm sure I'm dating myself here, but you can think about movies like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where the good guys aren't always as good as you think they are, and the bad guys aren't always as bad as you think they are. And then there's, I mean, it's just the story of Nosara is, as Gabby said, just complicated, and the players are interesting in this story. So one of the things that we did, and this slide, what we're trying to get at here, with the various, there was multiple kinds of studies that we did on Nosara, and hopefully we're not done yet, but we've done at least 3 different kinds of studies so far that build upon each other, and then we hopefully have some future work to do there. But one of the things that you find is that there's a whole different set of actors and they're a little bit difficult to categorize, but when we did categorize them, there are people that fall into the categories of developers, investors, there's the TICOs, the expats, and the environmentalists. And just that alone makes for a pretty interesting story because each one of them has a different interest in Nosara. Nosara, one of the things that I heard a local say the last time we were down there, and this breaks my heart if this is true, and this is what we're trying to avoid, is that the last 10 years are the best years Nosara is ever going to have. And that's an understandable feeling, given the tensions that have come up over the last 10 years in particular, when the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal all did articles about, hey, you want to be a digital nomad, or hey, you want to see the best yoga spot in the entire world, or hey, there's only 5 blue zones in the world and one of them's easier to get to than San Diego. That makes for a lot of visitors. And so every one of these players or every one of these categories comes at the questions or challenges of Nosara from a different angle. And our studies were really trying to get at the angles. What were the main points of tension? And that was made more complicated by the fact that there was inherent barriers. I don't want to say there's a lot of hatred flowing around in such a beautiful place, but there is a lot of mistrust. It probably falls sometimes short of hatred, and probably sometimes actually reaches hatred, where people don't trust each other, and this has resulted in lawsuits where you have wealthy people suing community nonprofits for breaking the rules on this or that. I mean, it just gets complicated because of mistrust and misinformation and a lack of communication. And all of that is exacerbated by the fact that Nosara is, as Alvaro, as our colleague Alvaro, who's not here with us today, Nosara is the jungle. Nosara is far away from governance. Nosara is, I mean, the provincial capital is hours and hours away over very bad roads. So, I mean, that doesn't help with the coordination or the attempts to address all of these issues. So you've got this interesting set of actors, and you've got these barriers that are somewhat unique to the place. But we did, ultimately, we were able to come up with kind of the main main angles on the parts that we wanted to study, or the challenges facing the community. And a lot of it is development versus conservation. It's been discovered. 10 years ago, Nosara, hardly anybody knew about Nosara. Nowadays, everybody knows about Nosara, and it's one of the world's only blue zones with this great culture in surfing and yoga, and everybody's going there. At the same time, you've got one of the most important turtle nesting beaches at the Oceanal National Wildlife Refuge. It's the second largest turtle nesting beach in the entire world in terms of numbers of turtles. You can see tens of thousands of turtles in a single night if you hit it right, and that's unique in the world. Development is going to have an effect on that because of, you might wonder, like, what's the big deal? Development is going to have an effect on that because of lights, because of vibration, because of dirty water, because of plastic. I mean, it's because of visitation, and all of those things are going to affect the turtles, who have no voice in the whole thing. By the way, there is definitely this sense of old ways versus new ways also, and that isn't just Ticos versus Gringos. Honestly, it's more complicated than that. It's actually, hey, I'm a person from California and I arrived here 25 years ago, and I sort of consider myself a local now. And there's a little bit of a NIMBY effect to that, where, you know, the people the expats who arrived a long time ago kind of have a feeling of superiority against the people who are arriving more recently. We've noticed that. There are certainly, in all of this, and this doesn't even need explanation, I don't expect, but there's a great deal of inequality and power imbalances. There's just a lot of money flowing around right there right now, where the locals have a tough time getting a job, and when they do get a job, it's often in the service industry. And at the same time, you have people building $100 million housing developments up on the mountain to overlook the ocean. There's certain tensions in that. And on top of that, as I said a few minutes ago, the regulatory framework is difficult, mainly because it's so far removed from where the actual governance happens on the peninsula. So all of our studies tried to get at these imbalances and these tensions. And as Abby said, it's pretty interesting that we came up with, as much tension as there is, there was fairly good consensus on the kinds of issues that the community of Nosara needs to be addressing in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. Am I supposed to be handing off? I think I am. Tina,
back to you, Gabby, for a couple slides there.
All right, so the project phases were very simple, and I think that's one of the beauties of working with people with so much experience like Tina. A big pie was broken down into 4 pieces, right? So we had community interviews, that are basically long format, 10-question interviews. We did it without a video, without audio, just basically human to human or over the phone, grabbing real good direct quotes and then process that. Then we had the Q study, which Greg will be the master Jedi on this topic today. And then from that, we produced and created and generated a community meeting, which is basically probably the most important part of this entire project, because it's when people actually see their faces and stop assuming positions, right? And finally, a co-production of a shared values statement, which could be pretty general in a way, but we're going to talk about that when the time comes, because it does provide a sense of unity. So here we have different samples of interviews that we did. I just want to make a shout out on the right side, Checho, the guy with the sunglasses on the blue table. He produced most of the interviews with me. We did the field ethnography. In the center, you have the classic guachiman, which is called here like the guy who watches over your car, like watches guachi, a local slang for locals that live there and survive in a way. And then you have on the left side a classic like educated San Jose person that comes and hears about Nosara and is coming post-pandemic to also find opportunities there. And obviously in these community interviews, something that's not included right in the process, but is very, very valuable, is that locals and expats that have been living there for 25 years start throwing maps and old newspaper articles and then the ads from the New York Times in the 1960s selling land in this pristine place. And basically from that, I just want to rescue it, because from there, I realized that Nosara is really interesting because there has always been a rush, there has always been a hype, and there has always been a scapegoat. So one time it was the gringos, now it's the people from San Jose, now it's the government. There's always the lack of like local governance provides a chance for new narratives of who is like the bad guy, right, or the good guy, to be placed upon each other. And add to that a place that has no like solid or printed press or used to have, and that has created a lot of speculation, and now you just have like chaos and beauty as well. So back to you guys.
Hi, everybody. Greg Munno here. Thanks so much for having us today. Those interviews that Gabby was talking about were the perfect starting spot for a Q methodology study. Q is this method that was developed by psychologist William Stevenson to unearth and explore subjective opinions people have that really aren't factually based necessarily, but that come from their life experience and their kind of subjective mental models. And so in this case, we were interested in their subjective opinions about priorities for Nosara's future. What problems did Nosara face? What assets does it have? And what do those things suggest about the way in which the community should come together and what it should focus on as a town moving forward? And so this process starts with these interviews and then extracting from them statements from the interview participants themselves about what they think Nosara should be focusing on as priorities in its future. And through an iterative open coding process, the team was able to develop a list of 97 kind of statements about the community's future, priorities for the future. That became the concourse, the first step in this Q study, that covered kind of the universe of opinion as we were able to discover it, about what the community should be focusing on. Then we went through another iterative process where we were looking to capture a subset of those 97 statements, something smaller that would be easier for the participants to wrestle with and rank, and yet represented as broad a spectrum of that overall opinion as possible. And we ended up with 37 statements that then the kind of heart of the Q study is the Q sort process, where participants then rank the statements from most important for Nosara's future to least important. And they do it on this grid that we're showing here. And I know you won't be able to read the statements on there very well, but we'll show you some of the statements in a second. But this normal distribution is really common to Q. It makes the ranking of the statements easier. Instead of just going 1 to 37, it allows you to pick a couple of favorite statements, a couple of statements that you reject really strongly, and then gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of ranking statements in a more neutral kind of position. So using the same plugged in team of Gabby and Checho, who conducted the interviews, we were able to get 79 of these Q sorts completed, which for a Q study is a robust number. It's not a survey. We're not trying to infer to the entire population what percentage of that population feels one way or another. We're just trying to unearth as many different perspectives that exist on this issue as possible with a defined population, which is the people of Nosara. And then you take those 79 Q sorts in a Q study, and you use factor analysis to reduce that to a more manageable number to really study. And the factor analysis essentially identifies clusters of opinion where you can say, hey, a good number of people in the community feel this way, and that contrasts to another cluster of people in the community who have a very different perspectives. I think this methodology has all sorts of benefits from a participatory process perspective. It really helps participants focus on their own priorities. Plus, in a Q process, you're oftentimes doing the in-depth interviews with the same people that you're doing the Q sort with, who then become some of the same people that come to the public dialogue. And so all of this just helps them understand their own perspectives. And maybe most importantly, they see themselves reflected back in the study instrument. Statements that they might have made during the interviews might be some of the same statements that they're then ranking. And so it feels authentic and genuine to the community that's being studied, or at least that's our hope and our goal. Next slide, Tina. So the 4 perspectives that emerged from the factor analysis was one group that was primarily concerned with environmental protection, another more with local governance, and we'll kind of look at what kind of define these really quickly, give you an idea of the statements as well. And we can provide the full study on this if anybody wants to look at all the statements. But where you can see perspective 1, we're really focused on issues concerning environmental habitat protection. And perspective 2 was also concerned about that, but more about the mechanisms for making it happen. And so we labeled that local governance. And then perspective 3 was not surprisingly, a lot of the TICOs loaded on this perspective. And this was all about improving local services, education, healthcare, basic opportunities, and access. And then perspective 4 also had a very strong environmental kind of grounding in perspective, but again, took a slightly different approach to how that would happen. And another great thing about Q is it tells you what defines the perspectives and what statements get ranked the most differently, but it also tells you where the bridges are between the different perspectives that emerge. And so these 4 areas here emerged as the most kind of, the rankings weren't necessarily the strongest, but everybody kind of agreed that these things were about equally important between the perspectives. And then finally, the statement that just received the overall most support was to create a sustainable development plan. It was ranked on the positive side of the spectrum by all 4 groups. It became some of the groups +4 statements, their most supported statements, and overall received the highest total score of any statement in the study. And so that became kind of a natural place for us to focus our first public meeting on. We already knew there was some agreement there. Christian did a good job of describing how fractious the community can appear. And we wanted to start with something that we knew that there was good consensus and support for.
So we wanted to also be able to report these Q results back to the community. We thought Q was a perfect tool for helping us to set up what would be a community dialogue. But in the research literature, you don't often see that being done. In fact, we couldn't identify any studies out there where people were taking the results of the Q methodology, presenting it back to the community and using that to create public deliberation or, public discussion about issues. Although I did just see that Jesse posted a link in the chat about a Participedia case using Q methodology. So we'll have to take a closer look at that. But after we got the Q results back, we decided we would hold a community meeting, and you could see pictures of that meeting up here, where we basically reported back to the community what we found. And then we led the community through a series of discussions about the social progress index and whether that reflected how they knew and understood Nosara. We led them through conversations about what the most important assets were for addressing the issues and challenges in Nosara. We presented to them the results of the Q study, and we asked them which perspective they identified with most. And then we wrapped it up by looking to the future and asking people, well, given there is this kind of area of agreement about the need for a sustainable development plan, what does sustainable development mean to you? Right? Because I don't think we could go around this room and we would get more than a dozen definitions about sustainable development, and what the first steps towards creating a sustainable development plan ought to be. We'll talk a little bit more about this community meeting as we talk about our lessons learned. But I should just say one more thing is that kind of given the mistrust in the community and given the animosity around particular groups in the community, we received a ton of warnings about security, right? People were like, oh, you've got to have police there. This could be bad. This could turn into a real problem. You've got to make sure this event is safe. People were worried about it. But I will say on that day, more people turned out than we thought. Many of them had participated in either the interviews or the Q study, and several people who hadn't participated in any of that came out. So we were overflowing in this space, and people really seemed to be able to come together and discuss these issues in a very productive way. So that was kind of after the community meeting, we wrapped up. I'll talk a little bit about our next steps in a moment, but let me say a little bit about how this all connects to teaching, right? And I loved in some of the work that Participedia had been doing, particularly around teaching cafes, is reminding people that teaching doesn't always learn in a classroom. So first, we really set out to figure out how can we help the community of Nosara by combining the best of practice and the best of academia? How can we use research to inform what we do on the ground? And how can what happens on the ground inform our research? And so for us, this was very much a pracademic process where, typically you think about the scholars coming in and doing a project. We really felt like we had a lot of education, a lot of learning to do on the ground before we could do anything that was consequential. We also had these incredible team members from Checho and Gabby and Alvaro and Stefano and others who were on the ground helping to implement many of these things. And they knew the context, right? They knew the language, they knew the people, they were connected, but they didn't maybe know the academic side of things. What's a Q study? How do you conduct these community interviews? How do we use this to shape what we do? How do we design a community meeting? And so we did a lot of kind of teaching and learning with each other so that we kind of understood context and they could understand methods and make sure that the data we were collecting were valid and reliable and useful. We also ran this community meeting, and it might not come as a surprise to this community, but one of the best practices we felt was really important was to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to speak at this community meeting, which meant we didn't want to do that traditional 3 minutes at the mic kind of public meeting, which kind of favors people like me, give me a platform, I'll speak forever. We really wanted to make it a place where everybody had an opportunity to do that. And that meant we had to have small table dialogues. So we got a bunch of locals together. We trained them in kind of facilitation, both in managing table discussions and scribing or recording those conversations. And so we kind of imparted this kind of basic skill set there. They all had fun. They were all really, really fantastic. And so I just want to say that kind of as a teaching and learning perspective, what was really important to us from day one was to figure out how do we make this research project a learning process for everybody involved, not just for the US team members or the Costa Rican team members, but for everybody in the community. And I think we were pretty successful about that. That's one of my one of the things that I'm most proud of for this project. We could also talk a little bit about kind of our lessons learned. And I think for this one, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Christian. Oh, Christian, you're still muted.
Thank you, Tina. I'm a Zoom freshman here. This is really just building on some of the lessons that Tina already talked about momentarily, but we wanted to look hard in the mirror and ask ourselves, what lessons did we learn as researchers? I sort of hate to use the word pedagogy, which seems kind of highfalutin, but to look at ourselves and look at the work that we did, and what did we learn besides besides the community wants a sustainable development plan, or what are the outside the box kind of lessons that we learned, and some of these are maybe not too far outside the box, but they still bear remembering or reminding. And one of them is certainly that we were able to, in a way, we were able to triangulate our findings because we came at it with different approaches, with different processes, and that was really important. And hopefully, if we undertake the fourth leg of the stool, that will add an entirely new element to it. One of the things that we also learned was that getting people to show up was hard. Getting people to show up and be candid and honest was even harder, and it was made especially hard by the fact that most of the researchers, like 3 out of the 4 main researchers, were United States academics. And so building trust was a difficult thing. We, as Tina mentioned, we put a lot of legwork and a lot of time into learning the complications of this beautiful but complicated community. And even at that, you just have to be humble about your perspective. You're coming from a place you don't have the institutional knowledge that the locals do. So you really are dependent on building strong relationships with people that you trust, that can parlay their trust with other people in the community. Another thing that we did find was if we're willing to put in that time and energy, then people will often surprise you with their candor and their honesty and their generosity. As Tina said, when we did have the community forum, we had people who kind of privately professed profound disgust with one another, and they came and sat at the table together and talked about their perspectives in honest ways. And that happened because for over a year, we built the relationships that we could be trusted, and we were building a process that could be trusted. That was a really important thing. And another lesson that we've learned, and this is kind of where we're at, this is going to segue into where we're at right now, is what do we do with this now? Ultimately, say we want to create a sustainable development plan. How do we help the community move forward with that? It takes time to do these studies, and the community is impatient, rightfully impatient, because it is changing every single day. And if we don't get the studies out for another year or two, it's going to be a different place at that point, and we will have lost a lot of the momentum that we built up over time. And at the same time, we're going to have to raise money. And I'm not asking anybody for money, by the way, but we are going to have resources in order to take the next step on this kind of stuff. And that comes with its own timing factor. And, you know, it's just another boundary that we're going to have to figure out. But I'm still, despite all the challenges that we've found in these studies, this community wants to be better. And that's a beautiful thing. That's the hardest thing. And we didn't have to create that. The community itself already had created that.
So this raises the question of where do we go from here? We kind of wrapped up the community meeting. We did a traditional academic journal article that was published in Sustainability. And we've been back to Nosara for some other work and other projects. And we've had multiple people come up and say, okay, what comes next? What are you doing? And the question for us is, how does a community actually build a sustainable development plan? We've done a lot of work to identify how those plans are built, what they're composed of, how you move forward with that. And our thought is that we could really work with the community to identify some shared values that might be used to guide the process. But again, were we to do that, we need some resources coming in. Given the mistrust, you know, if resources come from one foundation or another foundation or a particular group, other groups and individuals will be less trusting of the process because it's been paid for by some other party that they have a challenge with. So we're working through that with some community foundations, some people on the ground. Hopefully our next goal will be to do a series of convenings where we're helping the community to identify shared values that would guide the creation of a sustainable development plan. Another thing that has recently come up in the past couple of weeks is other communities in Costa Rica have heard about what we did in Nosara, and they've asked us to start replicating that. One of those communities is Santa Teresa, also in the Nicoya Peninsula, not too far as the crow, or I guess pelican flies in Costa Rica, but by travel by car, quite difficult or quite far away in terms of time. And so the question here is, can we replicate this participatory process in another community that's struggling with similar but also different issues? Santa Teresa is another well-known surfing town with lots of issues of poverty and inequality, with some environmental fragility. And so we'll be working with that community to repeat this process of interviews, Q study, community meeting as we come forward. And I think with that in mind, we're happy to kind of stop presenting now and turn it over to the audience for some questions and answers. So if you have an answer, toss up a hand or just unmic and let's hear from you. Any questions?
A question, Pat?
Yeah, Pat,
Hi.
go ahead.
So I put this in the chat. Oh, I see that Gabby started to
Okay.
respond. Yeah, I was curious about
Local
how difficult
community
it
and
was to
civic group.
organize these things. What kinds of groups were available there? How did you approach them? How were you received by them? What role did they play in the process?
That's a great question. We spoke to several community organizations and we're continuing to talk with them. We talked by a local governance board primarily, which is led by a community of expats. There's an association. There are kind of two big civic associations. I think they both have very similar names. One is like the Nosara Civic Association and the other is the Civic Association for Nosara. One is primarily wealthy expats who have been bought land in Nosara 20, 30, 40 years ago and are kind of wedded to the way that Nosara is now. The other is a local association, more of Ticos, more of locals who are there. We talked to investors, we talked to developers, we talked to a lot of business owners, we talked to, and Gabby could probably say this better than anybody, but literally during the interviews, they were talking to prostitutes and drug addicts, to billionaires who are building incredible resorts. So really kind of a very diverse group there. And just getting back to the associations, one of the challenges is we've had several associations say they would chip in for funding this or they would fund the project. But if we take money from one group, then other groups think that we've been bought and our neutrality is no longer there. So we're trying to figure out how do we get everybody to agree to small pieces of money that will, I mean, we are definitely objective in this, but that will give a strong enough appearance of objectivity to the community so they'll accept it.
Thank you. It's helpful.
Of course. I see Yasir, you have a hand up?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the to all the presenters. I'd like to know if you guys can give us an example of certain moments where there were some conflicts between the participants, conflicts in opinions, of course. And what mechanisms of conflict resolution have you guys used to bring people together, maybe to reach some kind of a compromise? And this is the first question. The second question is how, maybe I have missed this during the presentation, so I apologize. How did you guys prepare the participants to engage and contribute their opinions during the process? Thank you.
Sure, those are great questions. And I'm happy to let any of my team members jump in. But I would say the points of conflict, there were several of them. Some were about how should this community be governed? Some people wanted more governance, more planning, more regulation, more oversight. Well, other people kind of said, no, no, no. We want to have the wild, wild west approach that has been here for the last several decades, right? So the seat of the municipality is probably not far in terms of kilometers, but takes a few hours to get to by car. And so that means things like when somebody is building a new home, there are building regulations about how high that home can be. But if the home goes over that, by the time the regulatory body comes in to look at it, the house has already been built, not much is done. There are big conflicts over water and particularly sewerage issues, right? And requiring, of course, multimillionaires who are building these luxury mansions, they can certainly afford issues around septic, right? Well, to make sure that their sewerage is, I guess, done well, right? But the burdens of that on the locals is much more challenging. There are questions about how do we deal with poverty? And some groups say, well, we deal with that through economic development, building more resorts, building more hotels, building more restaurants, building more tourist activities. And others say, okay, but that further degrades our environment. And we're caught in this vicious cycle where if you end up killing all the turtles, right, or making the turtles go somewhere else, then one of those beautiful things that draws so many to us is now a detractor. And people would point to other communities in Costa Rica around that. Yeah, Gabby, jump on in.
Hi, Yasir. Thank you for your question. I just want to add a few more crucial elements for this to actually have happened without huge discussions, right? In terms of the community meeting. First, the Demo Lab is not a local partner. It's a San Jose-based nonprofit think tank political activism. So even if I was living in Nosara or Checho has lived in Nosara for the past 10 years and Alvaro has come and gone, we're not really from there, or we're not expats from there, and we don't have property there, right? So that gave us a clean slate of credibility that I think helped a lot. Then secondly, when you have people that invested time to give you an interview and probably took half an hour or an hour, that was then created into the Q-sort, and you're invited to a meeting where you're gonna see the results of your interview with 100 other people that also had the chance to respond with a lot of time, because we gave a lot of time to each participant, then you're really invested in that meeting and that process. You want to figure out what are they going to bring back in terms of data within a land that has no data, right? And who am I going to meet there? And also in terms of the actual meeting, it was very packed. You saw a couple of photos. It was in a restaurant that had the ability to give us logistical features that we needed. But I think it was a very public place. Even though we didn't bring media, we weren't taking a lot of pictures. I took a couple of photos with the iPhones. It wasn't documented. It wasn't broadcasted. So it was also a very public place in which you were sitting next to the local water board guy, then the guachiman that takes care of like the kids when they're surfing, then the local surfer entrepreneur that's now a millionaire. And then you have like a true like California billionaire. But they were all together in a place where like, if you were not there to construct, it was gonna be very evident. And as Chris said, even though people like hate each other and they were there in the same place, I think we all lived an experience of saying like, oh, maybe we can talk. Like, besides the decision of the community to express a need for a sustainable development plan, I think it was a surprise for them to actually be in the same place with such a random mix of people. And that was the most impressive, probably the gift that we were able to give them. Thank you.
That's a really great point, Gabby. Yeah, Christian, jump in.
This is a real lowbrow comment, I realize, but that's kind of my MO sometimes. I was a grassroots organizer, community organizer before I became a lawyer many, many decades ago. One of the things that I found that was really important with the time that we spent with people was taking it out of the sterile environment of an academic study. Like, drink a beer with somebody, have a margarita, share some ceviche. I mean, it honestly, it mattered it mattered for the study. It didn't just matter for the trust. I mean, ultimately the trust was a way of moving the study forward. So it wasn't just interviews and surveys and things like that. It was time spent at a surfside bar. I know that sounds like tough work, but it was really important. I know that's a small thing, but I thought that it was worth mentioning.
Yeah, Christian, I would agree with that. So yes, here for your last questions about conflict resolution and prepping the participants, I would say a lot of that was done informally, right? It was informal. It was through trying to connect and relate to people as humans in a particular place, and kind of trying to reassure people of our objectivity, being more focused on interests rather than positions. Like, we weren't there to play sides off of each other. We were there to find out, what was shared among the community. And that, I think, when it was no longer, one side versus the other side, but what brings us together, it just naturally changes the tone. Rebecca, I see a hand up for you.
That's very remarkable. Thank you very much, Tina, and everyone. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Yasir. Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I'm so happy that you're all doing this. Thanks so much for putting this on. As someone who's been sort of peripherally involved in Participedia for many years, and as a tica myself, as evidenced by the basket of tapitas that I have in my office, it thrills me to see that you're working on this project. And my question is a really simple logistical one: is how did you manage, or how did you deal with the language barriers, or especially when you had people you were training to transcribe things and everything? I'm wondering a little bit about that.
It's a great question. And it's exactly why we needed our local team, why we had Gabby and Checho and Stefano and Alvaro. Gabby, do you want to talk about some of the language issues we did?
Yeah, the interesting thing about this particular place and this country is that there's a mixture, right? So it's kind of 50-50. You have people that only speak English or only want to speak English, and you have people that only speak Spanish. And we basically divided the interview team depending on the report that they could provide. And then when Tina came and the team came from the US, we presented everything in English, but we have live translation. And that, I think, even though that's logical because we're in a Spanish-speaking country, Costa Rica and places like Nosara have been so overdriven by American influence and by English influence that people feel left out, right? And many of these projects and these things are made in English. So it was really important to have everything done in English and Spanish all the time. Because locally, I mean, it's just not fair, right? And they're usually left out of very important conversations, including, media that's being produced in Nosara is produced in English.
I would just add to that there are some things that academically, or at least US academic English, that they don't translate nicely on the ground. And so we were really grateful to our team there for saying, oh, stop being a wonk, say this in plain English, give us the layman's language, so in English, so we can translate it to layman's language in Spanish. And so there was a lot of that, which was really useful. I see that Mr. Bruna has his hand up, so we'll go there. And then there were a couple of questions on chat that we can come to. Mr. Bruna.
You're in mute, Pa.
Mute, unmute. Okay, sorry for that. Hi to everybody. Hi, Gabby. Hi, Tina.
Yeah, buddy.
Hi, Kristen. Hi, the rest of the folks. I'm in Costa Rica. I'm Gabby's father. I'm taking a look to the good, nice project of Nosara. My question is, what participation and, you know, I know this studies goes like 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago. Until now, what is the participation and involvement of the local authorities on the field? Because the main issues that this Q system find out is 3 main concerns for everybody: environmental protection, infrastructure, and education. These 3 angles have all regulatory issues, laws, and a system that works for the whole country, Costa Rica as itself. And how is the local, what is the involvement of the authorities of the municipalidad, which is 1.5 or like almost 2 hours travel away from Nosara, on the next step for the sustainability program you guys are proposing?
Great question. Anyone want to take that?
That's a tough one.
It's a tough one. You know, I want to be fully transparent here and say that, you know, the municipal government, and there were some folks from government, I believe, who came to our public meeting to kind of hear what we were doing, to see what this was about. Since then, I know that some of the civic associations and community groups have been having conversations about how to move forward, how to support particular projects in Nosara that would advance different goals. There has been, many of them have said they're interested in having us come back down and continue to work with them. For example, by convening them, helping them, leading them through kind of a process where those organizations could figure out plans for moving forward. But again, we're stuck on the resources bit, right? And it's not like any of us are looking to put money in our pockets for this. We just need to be able to cover expenses. If we do that, if we're able to move forward, then undoubtedly municipal government needs to be involved. And one extra little hiccup is that I believe there's a referendum coming. Is it this fall, Gabby, where there's a vote for, is it to have Nosara become its own municipality separate from Nicoya, right? Is that correct, Gabby?
I think there's a request to revise a new referendum regarding Nosara having its own governance, because it's so far away from the municipality that nothing gets done. This has been the historic issue that has made Nosara beautiful because it's separate, right? And autonomous in a way, and it has led expats to create their own forms of self-government in a Latin American country. And at the same time, it has created the problems that we're talking about now. So one of the blessings that made Nosara amazing and it made Nosara very unique is also now being very detrimental to its decision-making process. And I just want to add to that a little note that I remember in the community meeting, several people that were clearly from the municipality attending, but not attending. Like they attended, but they didn't want to put their name. Then we let them in, but then they didn't want to sit down. And then when they sat down, they didn't want to participate. And then when they were not participating, they were recording the entire session. So clearly, this was also for us a sense of, wow, there's a long road to take in terms of citizens and academia bringing in spaces of dialogue without the government being the central power player in that process, right? And that's a very small example that clearly indicates the division and the lack of collaboration.
I'd like to be really respectful of time, and I see we're at 3 o'clock now. There were 2 questions on the chat. Maybe we could answer those really quickly and then wrap up. So Mujgan asked about the role of gender inequality and the fragility of Nosara communities, and she would like some insight about that. And Gabby, maybe I'll let you answer that. And then Jess asked about what best practices we would recommend for a project of this nature in other parts of the world. So maybe Christian and Greg, I'll throw that to you. But Gabby, do you want to speak quickly about inequality, gender inequality in Nosara?
Sure. I think where we really saw it, besides the fundamental gender inequality structural problems around the world, is in the migrant community, right? And in the low, the basic services, right? So you have unprotected populations coming from Nicaragua to construction and cleaning. And I once spoke to one of the many investors in this town, and he told me, do you really want to make a difference here? What you guys have to do is find the resources to make the local health board, the local health hospital, which is very small, the best in the country. Take that clinic, which basically gives like a couple of surgeries a day, and make it the best in the country. Have the women that are having babies in this community in good health and in good condition, and the entire social structure will change. And it blew my mind, because we want to talk about bike lanes, and we want to talk about potholes, and we want to talk about moderation of drug use from foreigners that come to this place and think it's Tulum. But people are doing a line to get a basic health checkup for 4 or 5 hours under the sun. So, and the women are suffering that, right? The women and the children, most of all. So gender inequality and access to healthcare, for me, were very clear in Nosara that would be the golden spot. If we put $50 million into that clinic, it could change the entire future conception of the place.
Great, thanks, Gabby. Greg, Christian, any best practices you would say that we learned from this project?
Well, I have a thought. Greg, do you have one?
Yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Well, one of the things, it harkens back to something I mentioned earlier on in the conversation. I do come at these questions maybe with a slightly different angle, because I'm a professor of practice. I'm a clinical professor and a grassroots organizer in my heart. These people don't need more studies. The studies are a means to an end to them. I mean, the people of Nosara, they could care less about somebody's paper, honestly. The paper is only a tool to make the community a better place. So as researchers, I think it's super important to have some humility and remember that if you ever approach it as like, we're from America and we're here to help, get out of here. I mean, I'd say if you're not willing to invest the time and it's about a citation, then leave the people alone. Honestly, I think that these kinds of projects, this kind of project it only has utility if it makes the world a better place. So have the humility to understand that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, Greg? I think that's absolutely right. And so if you're gonna implement something like a Q study as part of a participatory process, I think you want to situate it as a tool or an exercise to help participants explore their perspectives and to give the meeting conveners something concrete to work with on the other side, rather than something that's academic. The quality of our data was such that we were able to publish it on the other end, but that I think if we went in with that as a goal, it would have hindered us. And then, of course, the connection to the local team, Alvaro Castro, and then his connections to Gabby and Checho. And I think that made all of this possible and help us ground everything and frame it as something that we were doing to better engage the community rather than for our own study purposes.
Thanks, Greg. I think you can tell we're all really excited about this project in Nosara and the combination of methods that we've used. I mean, we certainly learned a lot from it. If the study that was published was not our primary goal, but if anybody's interested in seeing that, it's open access at Sustainability, or you can email me. I put my email in the box. I'd be happy to send it to you and happy to talk to you more about this work and others we've done. So thank you all for coming out. Paul, I can turn it all back over to you. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you everybody for coming to hear about our work. We appreciate it. Paul.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say on behalf of Participedia, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully you take these learnings and offerings from Tina, Greg, Christian, and Gabby with you, reflect on them and bring them into your research academic. So very much look forward to what comes out of this, and thank you again for joining.
And we're looking forward to the Nosara case on Participedia.
You got it, Pat. We'll get that done.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye,
Ciao.
everyone.
Bye-bye.